Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to a rather special stream. He and I have sort of been in similar circles, but this is the first time we've had a chance. And today, to just sort of talk about what's going on, I'm joined by the Franklin. How are you, sir?
I'm well. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for coming on. Sort of first, you came on my radar when the distributist had mentioned you in a video. I think it was his grill pill video, and he had mentioned what he had called the Franklin's corollary, which I certainly love it when he tries to say that word because he never sometimes gets words right. But
I I think we should have a stream where we just get people from the chat to type words, and he just has to spend 2 hours pronouncing English words.
I recall when he started doing these Tuesday streams, he had said corollary again, and it's like corollary or something, and I just sent him a voice message saying, "Here you go," so you're not struggling.
My favorite one of his. Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I interrupted. My favorite of his is what is it? How does he say? Not exacerbate. He says exacerbate or something like that. Yeah, it's exacerbate. I think that's what he says.
Yeah, that one or origin. It's I can't even try to do with the distributisms here, but that's how I know you. Not to spend the first minute and a half here talking.
Yeah, he knows we love him. He knows we love him.
He certainly does. Because without, I think quite many of us wouldn't be where we are today online. So with all that in mind, how are you? Well, we've done the how are yous now, but I guess it's sort of interesting. We were talking before we went live on air, sort of the generational differences. We were talking about the word boomer, and then how Gen X sort of gets ignored by quite a few people, and that are getting just lumped in with millennials, which is interesting because I always distinctly identify Gen X in part because I'm 26 going on 27. My parents are Gen X. They waited to have kids, so it's just something that I can identify, but not so much everyone else.
Yeah, do your parents listen to 90s rock? They're into that whole thing?
No,
Soundgarden and Smashing Pumpkins and that sort of thing?
Well, I think my dad does. My mother was more country music sort of deal, but definitely I think my father for sure, just in part by nature of being in the military, like right out of high school.
Right. Yeah, it's weird to think of what Gen X thought it would be and what it is now. Because everyone my age is sort of into their careers. I'm not, but most people my age are really into their careers. And sort of that wasn't how it was meant to be for Gen X.
To be the career type?
Yeah, there was this sort of thing of Gen Xers were meant to be really cynical, and they weren't going to work for the man, that sort of thing. And most people have to, so that changed at some point, and they all became worried about their houses and that sort of thing, how much their houses are worth and their mortgages and things like that. It wasn't how it was meant to be.
Well, it sort of reminds me, just in part because I like older television, I think in part just because when you grow up on Armed Forces Network, you don't get anything that's current. You just get whole series that are bought wholesale, so you can watch them that are American or English speaking television, so you're not watching foreign cable or something like that. And the only reason why I know the shows exist is because of this. But there's this TV show called 30 something, which came out in the 1980s, sort of about baby boomers, just sort of a day-to-day life drama of having a house and family and kids. And I kind of just think of Gen X like that in a lot of ways, where the sort of youthful, uppity rebellion sort of attitude kind of gets settled into the house, the business, the shop, what have you. Sort of an interesting way of how time and repeats itself in some ways.
Yeah, I was only vaguely aware of that show. Did you ever see Family Ties? Did you ever watch that show?
Yeah, I did.
That's a classic. Well, that's interestingly because the boomers were not meant to turn out that way either. They were meant. The whole premise was they were these sort of washed-up hippies, and they weren't meant to become very suburban. And that was sort of the comedic tension in that show, was these washed up hippies trying to come to terms with suburbia and particularly the son, Alex P. Keaton, who was this young Republican, and that was sort of the comedic tension there. And originally he was meant to be a very unlikable character, but Michael J. Fox was just such an incredible actor and just had this sort of mass appeal that he actually became kind of the star of that show. But originally he was not meant to be likable. But yeah, it was that sort of tension between the boomers, who were going to be, all this sort of like Age of Aquarius stuff, and then the reality set in that they ended up in the burbs with kids, one of whom was a young Republican. Yeah, I think the same thing happened with Gen X. Actually, we were all sort of, there was that whole sort of thing, Rage Against the Machine and Nirvana and Courtney Love. She was going to sort of fight the system. They're all going to fight the system. Didn't end up that way.
The only reason why I know about Family Ties is because I had an English teacher, I think senior year of high school, who compared me to Alex P. Keaton. And I had no idea what she was referencing to, and I had to like look up the show, and I was like, oh, okay, this makes sense. Because my high school self was probably the cringy, nice shirt and pants wearing kind of kid that like read the Fountainhead or Atlas Shrugged, and I was like, yeah, this jives with me. So that's how
he was
the only reason why I know. Yeah.
It's like that show. I never really watched it, but what was it called? Parks and Recreation or something like that. Do you know the one I mean? With that Ron Swanson. Again, that guy was meant to be really unlikable. He was meant to be this complete character, sort of the way East or West Coast American liberals would write a conservative character as this kind of complete cliche and make him very unlikable, but he ended up becoming the star of that show. It sort of backfired on them.
Well, yeah, and I think that's the thing is that they don't know how to make, at least if the writing is decent, when they try to go out of their way to characterize someone on the right, or what, for us in America, flyover country where I live, it oftentimes comes off in a rather respectable or almost charismatic fashion. Like there's a lot of men that can relate to Ron Swanson because they work for the man, but they hate the man, sort of in that sort of manly libertarian style kind of way that he is. Which is always interesting because the actors are never by all means conservative in any way, shape, or form. It's just even with like The West Wing, Aaron Sorkin could write like sort of your and I haven't watched the show in years, but I mean they had that sort of like mid 90s moral majority female Republican, blonde, tall, and could argue her position to work with them and like sell stuff to the right. But I mean even then she didn't come off like a complete caricature or evil. Which is interesting because if you watch that show now, the evils of the mean, old, nasty sort of standard of the line Republicans of the 90s was just like make English the national language and focus more on homeschool and the moral majority stuff. And it's like, man, I would like to have that Republican Party of Aaron Sorkin's nightmares of the 90s. And here we are now.
Yes, that's right. It's amusing actually looking back at these things that everyone was freaking out about how evil they were. And I can't help wondering if a lot of people on the left actually secretly would like to return to that world.
I don't know how much that could be the case. I mean, I don't know. Maybe this is my generational limitation because it's just like today, every day is the end of the world for the left in some form or fashion. They've bought into their own personal eschaton that's like tailored for them to a specific fashion. So if if you're vegan or if you're environmentally inclined, you have climate change. If you're more of a racial restorative justice person, you have sort of the police eschaton. So maybe there's this desire to return to a calm where it's just like, oh, they just want more homeschooling or like prayer back in schools. not whatever is concocted today, where we're just a bunch of genocidal maniacs when we're probably not.
Yeah, I don't mean that they would want that as such. I mean that they would want that kind of environment where those were the, sort of first world. It's like first world problems where
Yeah.
those things are sort of your biggest concerns, because there was at least some sort of sense of normalcy, and even, for instance, the way that George Bush Jr. got rehabilitated, because I remember when he was literally Hitler, and until someone who is even more Hitler came along, and that sort of rehabilitated George Bush Jr. into a lot of people on the left suddenly thought he was this really good guy, which was funny because the same people were screaming 20 years ago about how he wasn't a good guy. Yeah, it's crazy, all of that.
Well, I grew up during the Bush years, and my subscribers know this. It's just I have a weird, bittersweet nostalgia for George W. Bush. I don't like the man by any way, shape, or mean, but when you grow up as an army brat and you viscerally remember 9/11, my father was in the Pentagon that day, so we thought he was
Oof.
dead for a good portion of it. And so you
Yeah.
started to like really start watching the television, and you do the whole "I hear you" speech. We're going to bring them to justice. You kind of like really want to get politically and emotionally invested in what this man has to say. And even though he kind of comes off like this aloof, man of the people, despite the fact he comes from a political dynasty and has an Ivy League education, it's just, I mean, you look back now, and there's a great Twitter account for those who are listening called George W. Bush era leftism bot, and it literally just reposts all of the memes depicting George W. Bush as like a chimpanzee or Hitler, and it's quite entertaining to say the least. But yeah, it's definitely a different time.
Yeah, and I think I mean, people in the media here still talk about Trump, and I think everyone was really hyped up about George Bush Jr., but like I said, it was like he was totally Hitler until someone else who was totally Hitler came along, and people still can't wrap their head around the Trump years. So George Bush Jr. has been rehabilitated in that regard.
Yeah, he is with his paintings or those memeable images of him hugging Michelle Obama at state events. It's quite. But I think the George W. Bush is literally, the devil has kind of come back when they were referencing. He had given a speech somewhere, and he was referencing the current war going on in Ukraine. And he says, no man should have the unilateral authority to launch an illegal invasion into Iraq. And then he had to correct himself.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, funny.
Well, and it's funny that you had mentioned what if the left would like to go back to anything, and it's sort of interesting that I'm sure a lot of them would like some return to 90s Fresh Prince in a lot of way, like center-right liberals do, but at the same time they've bought into their own historiography, like we can't go backwards, we can only go forwards. So I would love to sit down and maybe ask someone of that mindset what would they like to go back to, if at all. But I do think maybe deep down it is just a return to the 90s.
Yeah, it's a weird situation because I think you're definitely correct that here's a bit of trivia for you. On the Australian coat of arms, there are two animals, the kangaroo and the emu. And the reason they were chosen for the coat of arms is because they can't walk backwards, they can only go forwards. So it's very much like that. They're like kangaroos or emus in that, yes, they can only go forwards. But I think for the sort of middle class, say Gen X and Boomer liberals, all is not well because they can see their children are actually in very precarious situations. And it's not a given that their children are going to sort of enjoy the fruits of progress Their children are going to be marginally employed. They're never going to own houses. They have all sorts of mental health issues, yada, yada, yada. And there's something sort of gnawing away, I think, at these people my age and older, because they know that all is not well. And if this is progress, then it's not what they were promised. But of course, they can't admit that. But every so often, they let it slip that all is not well, and that they're slightly disturbed by it all.
Well, we see the same thing here in America. I mean, every other article I can remember, maybe post 2010 onwards, was just sort of starting, like the numbers were beginning to be sort of crunched, and that they were noticing that millennials weren't going to enjoy the same standard of living as their parents, and that they were beginning to notice things in regards to they're having less sex than their parents' generation did. They're having a considerably less enjoyable time finding economic opportunity, and they talk about it, and then they demand more intervention in the way that sort of got a lot of these problems started in the first place. But that's sort of part of how the ratchet turns, is just that you create problems to sell solutions that will create problems to sell solutions, and the ratchet just keeps on turning in that regard.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. And of course, they really don't want to admit that they're wrong, and they really don't want to admit it to anyone who's vaguely right wing. That if this is progress, why does it suck? And so, yeah, they're really caught between a rock and a hard place in this regard, because, as you said, they can only go forwards, but there's a sneaking suspicion that forwards is actually not going to be that good.
Well, yeah, but I mean, again, they can't admit that there's maybe that their opponents or their enemies are correct, because that would acknowledging that your enemy has a point, and they can't have that. It's just an interesting thing to notice across sort of the West, especially like the Anglosphere, that there's all very clear, noticeable problems of decline. But the thing I always find fun about it is that there's no acknowledgement of any sort of spiritual or psychological starting point to discuss. I don't mind having conversations with people with maybe more Marxist leanings, or discussions that are more focused on the material, but they never cross that line. So we can point at the facts and say objectively, oh yeah, things are very wrong. There's of course the issue in regards to there's this rampant antinatalism. There's this rent-tier economy that's being formulated. It's very disgusting. And yet they won't go any further, or they'll just flat out say, yeah, that's terrible, but I want it for myself. But everyone else needs to sort of get their stuff on track. It's just a very interesting position where of cognitive dissonance with your average person, not someone that I would say is in charge of anything.
Do you think liberalism is going to be abandoned?
I think that I don't think so. I mean, if it's going to be abandoned, it'll be some kind of what I would call hard illiberal liberalism, sort of what they complain about Viktor Orban or something. Just in America, in places where democracy is much more given its parade or veneration, it's I think that you will just see a doubling down, more of the same, more of the grift, more of the positions for diversity, more positions for making sure that we have equitable distribution of outcome. Just I don't think that a lot of the thing, and this is something that had come across my mind as of late, was just that the things that we were sort of complaining about, akin to the right in maybe 2015, 2016, when there was the really big conversations about academia and Marxist professors or intersectionality. It feels very strange that a lot of that discourse kind of just sort of disappeared off the map. Like, we acknowledged that this was a problem, and then we sort of moved on. And I just feel like that maybe that was something that we shouldn't have done, at least on the right in general, because I do feel like there's still a lot worth discussing how this stuff works, because if you know how it works, then you can sort of understand the mechanical causality of it and where it goes.
Yeah, I tend to think that we're going to keep the sort of ceremonial aspects of liberalism, if you like, but the whole thing will be a complete farce. But I mean, I think very much like the British royal family, that they're just sort of this weird institution, and they don't really exercise power. We'll sort of keep all of the mythology and the ceremony of democracy and whatever liberal values were or are. Those things will sort of continue in name, I suppose, but they won't have any teeth to them.
Well, I know they had the Jubilee this week for what was it, the 75th, right, of her reign, and I
70th, I think, maybe a
70th.
75th.
I'd have to check. The royal family is a weird artifact of American celebrity culture that I don't understand how we have that. 70th, someone points out in the chat. Okay. But I noticed that sort of the royal family occupies an interesting space where it has sort of this relative broad spectrum support or favorability. In America, we had that with sort of our sports entertainment, but that, of course, got inevitably tainted by politics. It's sort of a metastasizing tumor in that regard. Nothing is political anymore. I think when leftists would talk about the personal as political, it really did enter every frame that you got into. And now, of course, the politics of the royal family is now kind of moving in that direction about diversity, or of course Meghan and Harry not being a part of the family anymore.
Yeah. I mean, my point was just about the sort of the fact that the royal family is this sort of, I don't know, it doesn't have any teeth, doesn't actually do anything. They keep it around. And I wonder if a lot of the things that were taken as a given when I was younger about liberalism, if those things they'll still keep them around. I think they'll need them because there needs to be sort of mythology and founding myths and all of this sort of stuff. I mean, even just the way they sort of go through this whole thing of the will of the people, and the people don't have any will. But it's still necessary for them to make a nod in that direction. They can't just say, oh, look, we don't care. We're just going to completely ignore what people think. They still have to make a nod as though elections matter and that sort of thing. I think they'll keep those around.
Well, I would imagine they have to in order to maintain some illusion of legitimacy. It was interesting. I was halfway through university when Trump was elected, to give away my age, like I had mentioned earlier. But it was interesting listening to one of my constitutional law professors basically just sort of have this panic attack, being like, well, I have to explain to my students that the real separation of powers doesn't work the way that it's supposed to on paper. And I'm like, well, it hasn't worked the way it's supposed to on paper for like at least a century. What are you going off about? But it's just interesting to say the least in that regard. I think you're right that they'll keep the pomp and circumstance to maintain the illusion, but it'll be one of those things where it's like, the X party won, but we kind of know how it played out. Which there was an election for you guys just recently, wasn't there?
Yes. Was it? It was the 21st. Was it 2 weekends ago now? Yeah, it must have been 2 weekends ago. Yes, there was. I don't know if you want to discuss that or not. I don't know if you know much about Australian politics.
I know that it's a mandatory election. So I believe, didn't you do a video where you had or posted something that you had drawn on your ballot?
Oh, yeah. Yes. So it's compulsory to vote in Australia, and I've actually only voted a few times because it's not compulsory if you're overseas. And so I've actually spent more than half of my adult life abroad. And so additionally, even when I was in Australia, I moved around a fair bit. So the Australian Electoral Commission, it's an independent body who run the elections and all of that sort of stuff. They never sort of caught up with me. Recently they have. I think it's all to do with it's to do with your driver's license. It automatically gets forwarded to the AEC. So anyway, I've actually only voted in a few elections because I made a point of trying to avoid doing so. So anyway, yeah, at the previous election, in a sort of moment of weakness, I did a lot of research into different parties, and I studiously prepared my own sort of a ballot to take into to copy. In some sort of moments of weakness, I thought I should do my civic part. But this time around, I was back to my usual cynical self, and I cast what's called an informal vote, an invalid vote, basically. And I drew a little picture on there of a guy fighting a dragon. There was the what was it? The monster of manufactured consent, and the man was a little he was a little Aussie bastler, which is this kind of sort of I don't know if there's exactly an American equivalent, but it's sort of like the Australian everyman who's just trying to get by. And he's basically just an ordinary decent guy, but he's just struggling. He's battling. So yeah, he was battling the monster of manufactured consent. It'd be funny because I've actually done scrutineering, which is the people who observe the ballot count.
Yeah.
People, you can do. You have to be nominated by a candidate to go and do it. But I've done that before, both as a child and as an adult. Actually, one of my friends ran for local council, so I went and scrutineered. So I've seen the process, and what happens is it's pretty quick. The people who actually count the votes, so if there's anything that's sort of disputed or an informal vote or whatever, they just put it in a pile. They don't even look at it. It's really quick when they're doing these votes, like 3 seconds per ballot. So then the person who's in charge, the returning officer, at the end collects all of those ballots and puts them all in a big pile, and all of the scrutineers can come and stand in front of the table, and that person pulls the top one off and says, okay, this is invalid. Does everyone agree? This is informal. Does everyone agree? Yes. Okay. This one. Okay. I'm going to say this one's valid, and I'm giving it to this candidate. Does everyone agree? And they'll spend maybe 10 seconds on each one, and there'll be a few chuckles when there's something like someone will write, F you or something on there, and everyone will go, like this. But occasionally there'll be something that's funny, and everyone, including the returning officer, they all laugh at it. So I thought, rather than just write some sort of 500-word rant that nobody's going to read because they only have 5 or 10 seconds to look at each one, I thought I'll draw a picture. Maybe it'll be funnier for them. It'll lighten their day up, I guess. That was sort of the extent of my political involvement in the election.
So from my time in university, I had a similar role as an elections judge. I had served 2 terms. And unfortunately, we don't get paper ballots where I live in Texas. So everything is done with an electronic voting machine and whatnot. So you don't get anything, unfortunately, like that. Although I do have like a few stories of people just blatantly breaking like election rules. Like, you're not supposed to photograph yourself in there or like take pictures of your ballot. Or it's just interesting sometimes when you'll get like older individuals that are rather infirm, just hard of hearing, yelling about how can they vote for this person, or like where do you vote for that. And then of course the system is just so intense, because like if the machines break down, like, well, you have to call in a number for tech support and hope that someone gets out to you in the next few hours before the polls close, and then you have to tell everyone that things are just going to go a little slower because there's less machines for you to operate on. And of course, if you're inside the building after the polls close, you're obligated to keep them inside. It's their right to vote. And so, which is always frustrating because it's done at like a public school or something like that. So they have to keep staff available to lock up the place, which is always frustrating. But I just remember like this old lady saying, like, it was during the 2016 election primaries, and she's just like on her walker and she's just screaming, "I'm going to vote for Donald Trump. I'm going to vote for Donald Trump." And it's just like, "Ma'am, I need you to keep your voice down." And the gentleman I was working with is just this older gent also on a walker, and I'm the only person there under like 30 trying to make sure the machines don't break down and everything's in place. And then when you're done with the day, you have to disassemble the machines, take the cards out, get a printed receipt readout, basically on receipt paper, for all the vote tallies and counts, and make sure that there's nothing that looks weird. And then you have to drive from wherever you're at with all of these machines in like your truck or trailer back to the city and drop them off along with the paper and make sure that everything hasn't been tampered with. And it's just a ridiculously ineffective mess that can definitely have its own shenanigans to play out. But I would love for paper ballots so I could read people's rants. But our system is far too just go punch a card and take your sticker kind of deal.
Yeah, you don't even get the fun of people writing their thing on there. One of my friends, he you can't do this in Australia. You can't do what do they call it? What do you guys call it? A write where you write somebody's name in who's not on the
Write-in
ballot?
candidate or write-in
Yeah.
ballot.
Yeah, you can't actually do that in Australia. But one of my friends, he wrote a write-in for Uncle Vlad. I can only imagine how that would have been received. Yeah, so I don't know. It was a bit farcical, but yeah, the election. I don't know if you want me to get into it. It was I don't know. I think it was inevitable, but a lot of people were shocked and dismayed. The party that just got kicked out, they'd been in power for about 9 years, so it's pretty likely that they were going to lose anyway. But there was this sort of, so the party that just got kicked out is supposedly centre-right.
The Liberals, right?
Yeah, it's named after classical liberalism. And they're sort of, I don't know, they're probably sort of equivalent to the Tories in England. They're not exactly like the Republicans in the US. So they got kicked out. And the big thing, though, was that where they lost a lot of seats was in their really safe seats, the sort of very wealthy inner suburban seats, people on high incomes, that sort of thing, because there was this campaign of so-called independents. Funnily enough, they're all funded by the same person. They all had the same branding. They all had the same T-shirts, but they're independents, called the Teals, because here it's the reverse to the US. It's like in the UK where the centre-right is blue and the centre-left is red. So it's the reverse to the US. So these women, they're all women. They're called Teals because they're sort of like blue plus green. So they're running on these sort of green issues and some other things too. And they bumped off a lot of very high profile guys in formerly very safe centre-right seats. And now the centre-right is sort of in disarray because they don't know what to do about all of this. But the whole thing was completely manufactured, of course. I think it was sort of inevitable. And I think this is one of the problems with the right. So Australia's probably a little bit behind the US in this regard, in that the sort of professional, middle class, wealthier people have only just sort of finally caught up in shifting to the left because of a whole lot of social issues. I mean, they still want all of their high incomes and all of that. They want all of the sort of economic liberalism, but they're relatively progressive on social issues. And this has been the sort of the big sea change this election, where those people have flipped over to the left. But they're kind of in denial about that. The appeal of these so-called independent candidates was that because they're supposedly independent, these people in sort of wealthy suburbs could hold their noses because they weren't really voting for the left. But I mean, of course they were. So that was the sort of the big change in politics here. And the candidates themselves, there had already been a few of these kinds of candidates who had won at previous elections, but there was a big wave of them this time. And they're all Gen X professional women, from very wealthy backgrounds, private school girls, all of this sort of thing. But there's one of these women. I think she got elected at the previous election. Her name's Zali Stegel, and she was actually a professional skier. Now, Australia's not exactly known for its ski fields. We do have mountains here with snow, but it's not like North America or Europe. So she spent part of her childhood living in France, and the other part, when she returned to Australia to attend her private school, she spent it jet setting over to the Northern Hemisphere for her skiing career. And of course, she's lecturing everyone on climate change and their carbon footprint. And it's just, you can't make this stuff up. It's so ridiculous. But that's sort of the state of Australian politics at the moment. The Karens, I called it the Karen change election, because it's all these sort of ex-private school girls with corporate careers who have spent their lives jet setting abroad, and live in these very wealthy inner Melbourne or inner Sydney suburbs, lecturing the sort of the great unwashed masses out on the fringes of the cities and in the rural areas about how they shouldn't drive as much, whilst they're sort of jetting off to Aspen or St. Moritz for the next skiing trip. But that's where it is. That's where politics is in this country.
Well, I have been on something on that similarly here in America. We had, of course, recently the Disinformation Board that was being discussed is still full steam ahead in its creation. It just won't have the original woman that they had in charge, Nina Jankowicz, who, of course, kind of was just laughed off of the position in some ways just because of her very performative TikTok style face of wide eyes, wide smile, various gesticulations. And she's a millennial, but she's an older millennial, so like 40 is very much well on the horizon for her, and she doesn't really have any progeny or anything to really show you the sort of traditional standard of what a successful or a wholehearted, well-lived life for a woman would be. And there's just sort of this growth of that in America, where a lot of the millennial journalist or permanent managerial class style people are beginning to sort of see, quote unquote, the wall on the horizon, or at least that over the hill midlife crisis bit. And I always find it interesting to where there's more and more that are kind of coming out of the woodwork that people talk about. And it's just an interesting political dynamic here in the US, kind of similar to your well-educated careerist ski trippers that really don't care too much about the people that they would be lecturing on. It's just something that we see here in America as well, but not so much Gen X, but just older millennial women that are kind of getting up there, your girl boss or your Sheryl Sandberg lean in types. And it's just like these are the people that are essentially dictating policy, because our legislature doesn't really debate legislation. They don't write it. It's the shell legislation that gets basically passed, and it tells our executive agencies how to go make up your own rules. And then these crazy people make up the rules. And it's just this very interesting coordination, of course, between interests and careerists, and then of course the media. And there's just this over prevalence of women that do it. And I think someone had coined the term TCOG, theater kid occupied government, which I think is just very applicable to here in the US. Of so much of it is so saccharine and performative, where even at the beginning of this administration, they had the effeminate TikTok male with the painted long fingernails, doing a day in the life of a White House intern. And it's just this is where we're at. It's just this performative in the name of, right, where we're going to make you feel good, but we're still going to do all the things that you hated. It's very much the meme embodied of, like, Republicans will tell you no, but Democrats will tell you no, but they'll have like a hashtag BLM and a pride flag sticker in their messaging.
Yeah, what was that video that distributors did? He called it something like that, theater kid something or other. What was it?
Oh,
it was along
it was one of his Tuesday streams, but something about theater kids. Yeah, I'd have to look it up, but one of his sort of weekly Tuesday sunset streams that he mentioned it. It's I think it's just sort of something that we have to deal with in the US, is that it sort of came alongside with the critical theory intersectionality stuff. It's just that you have to be, things are performative, like Judith Butler, gender is performative type deal. And so between, Instagram, YouTube, Vine, TikTok, it's just you have to live the performance as much as you have to say it.
Yeah, the person who springs to mind most in this regard actually is Justin Trudeau. He was sort of the first of these people, and he's very much the poster boy for all of this. Do you remember that meme? It was, I don't know, 2015 or 2016 or something, where somebody asked him something about how his cabinet was very diverse.
Yeah, 50% women, and he said because
And
it's 2015.
yeah. He was really sort of ahead of the curve on all of this kind of stuff, because we've got that here now. The incoming cabinet apparently is the most diverse cabinet ever, and actually the prime minister, he has an Italian surname. He's the first non-Anglo-Celtic prime minister. So, well, he's half Irish, but he has an Italian surname. So everyone's making a big deal about this. There was one very funny moment, though, in the election. So there's a seat in Western Sydney that's very multicultural, particularly Vietnamese. And there was a woman who was involved. She'd been in politics for ages at various levels and roles, called Christina Keneally. She's actually American originally. And she's very much that sort of girl boss type. And she lived in, of course, she didn't live in a multicultural working class part of Sydney. She lived in a very affluent area of Sydney over near the beach. So they tried to parachute her into what they considered to be a very safe seat. And it backfired massively. A local Vietnamese woman ran against her and did her like a dinner. And that was completely unexpected. And it actually almost cost the government the new government majority, because they have 70. You need 76 seats, and they have 77. It was looking like they wouldn't have a majority, and it might have been because of her. But that was sort of a very hilarious kind of narrative collision, where they tried to parachute Gen X white woman, girl boss woman, into a very ethnic seat. And the ethnics rebelled. They said, no, we want one of ours. So they have an independent who is actually a true independent. She's not one of these so-called teals, this Vietnamese woman now. So yeah, that was one moment of hilarity in what was otherwise a pretty horrible sort of turn of events. I mean, I didn't care in the sense of the centre-right party. In fact, I'd say on balance, I'm glad that they lost. But I didn't think there was going to be any sort of actual reason for celebration on the right, on the true right. But that was just one moment of hilarity, that narrative collision of the sort of born to rule white Gen X woman being booted out by the because what happened was there was a retiring politician, and he actually handpicked his successor, and the party overruled him and parachuted this woman in, and the local electorate rebelled. So there was one funny moment in the whole thing.
We had a very similar situation back when I had lived in El Paso. So Beto O'Rourke is originally from there, who's currently running for governor here in Texas. And he originally ran for Senate in 2018 and almost won. But so he had sort of abdicated and said he wasn't going to run for re-election. So, of course, El Paso being a border city, it was going to be a Democratic seat anyway. But there was this sort of middle-aged career, a woman who worked for the El Paso Independent School District School Board. And she was basically just trying to have this like very astroturfed campaign where like she was actually like knocking on, like she was actually doing what you would expect from someone to run for office, like actual electioneering. And of course it was just like this very strong ethnic rebellion, and they ended up voting in the county judge, Veronica Escobar, who's just as equally terrible. But you do see that on occasion. I'm not surprised that the ethnic enclaves, of course, they're voting for their own. It's par for the course.
Yeah, well, normally the Labour Party, I mean, they do have a lot of ethnic candidates, and many of those were elected at the recent election. And normally they do that, but in this instance, I guess they really wanted to get this woman in. That's right. She was a senator, but there was something about some factional issue in the LP, so she was down the list for senators, so it wasn't a given that she was going to get re-elected. They gave her kind of safe Senate spot to someone else. So that's why sort of last minute they tried to parachute her into what they considered to be a safe Labour seat. I think normally they wouldn't have done that. It was I think they were sort of desperate because they needed to find somewhere for her in a hurry because of all these factional issues. But normally they wouldn't tend to do that. I think they do have a lot of ethnic candidates in ethnic areas, and they generally have the ethnic vote.
Well, it has a tendency to occasionally backfire. I mean, I think we've both seen that now. The thing that also it came to my mind on the subject of elections, because like you had mentioned, I think what's the phrase is like a donkey vote or something like that, where you
Yeah.
just don't.
Oh, donkey votes, that's slightly different. That's where
Okay.
you just because we have a very strange electoral system here, but basically have to number all of the candidates. So if there are 6 candidates, you have to put the numbers 1, 2, 6, at least in the lower house. Otherwise, the vote doesn't count. So a donkey vote is where you just go from the top to the bottom, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You don't go 4, 1, 3, 2,
Oh,
6,
okay,
5
okay.
like that. It's just where you just go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 like that. So it's a very specific thing. But people often use the term donkey vote for an invalid vote.
Okay,
Even though
that's the term I was familiar with as an American with the mandatory system. But there was this conversation, I think it was the other day, earlier this week, with Endeavor and the Distributist that it always brings me something to what I put a lot of focus on, and I know that you do as well, based on the Q&As that you do with your monthly stream. Is that Endeavor had mentioned about online movements, and he says that the one area that he's optimistic about is what people do, when they're off the internet, when they're not online, and that always gives me hope as well, just in part because for the audience that did happen to attend the U.S. event last February, that was the whole speech that I gave was just about how to get people offline so much and to do things that matter. And I always get very comforted when people talk about, the youth that they're talking to, or even something as simple as just like, being more self-sufficient with a garden. And I do think that with our present, like I have it on the title, our present predicament, which is just, I guess, modernity, is it's always nice to hear about how people are doing or what strategies have worked. And I think that that's something that you've talked about to a degree as well in your streams. Is just what you've been working on, just not on the internet, because your content isn't like much others, where many people kind of make this sort of a side hustle of sorts, where there's regular stuff being put out. Not to say that you don't, but you have your monthly streams. But you when you do stream, it's always about things that are very applicable or tangible and relatable to what people can actually do, which is something I appreciate.
Yeah. Well, I don't monetize anything. Well, because I wouldn't make that much money off it anyway. Maybe it's a pride thing. If I don't monetize it, then I don't have to admit that I wouldn't make very much money from my channel. But also I don't need the gibs and that sort of thing. So I figure there are other people who need it more, what have you. So I don't do that, and that does actually allow me to basically please myself with the channel. There is very much that thing. I think every YouTube creator notices, and I notice it to a certain extent, but where you become known for a particular thing, and then everyone wants you to do more of that thing, and it's very hard to do anything else. But especially because I'm not monetized, I think I have more latitude in that regard. But I mean, sometimes some things are not received well. I think maybe eventually want to talk about the book thing, but I did this whole thing for a book, recording it in 2019, and I put out very few other videos, and that wasn't particularly well received. But yeah, look, I do try to make it a little bit more focused. So usually with my streams, I talk about what I'm doing, sort of my own goals. I don't necessarily go into them in great depth, but I talk about those things, and then I respond to various questions that my subscribers put to me. I have a pretty good set of subscribers, actually. I don't really tend to have many trolls. So the people are fairly thoughtful, and they ask me thoughtful questions. Yeah, so I try to respond to that kind of thing. And I mean, I'd like to make more videos about things like homeschooling and homesteading and that sort of stuff, but I'm not particularly au fait with technology and doing sort of editing and all of that kind of stuff. So and it's very time consuming to do those kinds of things. The actual production of those kinds of videos takes ages. So so I don't tend to do those. I actually would like to do more talking about things such as homeschooling, and probably not so much gardening stuff, because then there's actual video involved rather than just audio. But yeah, I do a lot of things offline. I just don't cover them completely. So sometimes I think people might have the wrong impression that it's all doom and gloom. But I am actually trying to do things offline. And my kids are in various groups. So one of them is a class that's run by two former teachers. We had these mandates here. They didn't want to participate in those, so they put together an activity, a class, whatever you want to call it, for local homeschooling kids, and they're making a living from that now. So we're involved in things offline, just I don't go into them, probably for privacy issues and so on. But yeah, we're doing things offline.
Well, it's always important to focus on the offline. Charlemagne in chat is sort of behooving you to monetize, just as a suggestion. Which, you know, if the right can't figure out to make a shitload of money, he says we are going to lose. Which to some...
It'd be embarrassing for my channel. I'd make about $7 a month.
Well, look, I don't make that much either from the ad revenue. The subscribe star certainly helps with keeping medications relatively affordable here in the States with my medical situation. But it does help. It does go. It helps pull the extra distance. It's always wise to do it because you never know. Not to mention, like you had said, that you are working on things that I think people would genuinely enjoy. And there's the thing about it is, even though there's the parasocial, I think people do, especially on the right in our sort of circles. I think what the Distributist did today with this like 7 hour 49 minutes, you know, video of just going through his entire like library essentially of what he's read and what he likes and what the takeaways are. There's an appreciation for authenticity.
I was very disappointed with his bookshelf because it wasn't color coded. You know that meme of sort of the liberal midwit where they've got all the orange books, they've got all the green books, or it's sort of like a rainbow, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so they've got all the red books moving into the orange books, into the yellow books, like that. I mean, that's not how I would arrange my bookshelf, but it's you know, that's the thing that liberals do. Yeah, I was disappointed in that regard that they weren't color coded on his bookshelf. But yeah, that sort of thing. It's very wholesome. I mean, just from the monetization issue, I don't have a problem with other people doing it. But as I said, I think there are other people who need the money more. So rather than subscribers giving me, like, let's say, for instance, that I could make a lot of money from the channel, I don't need that money as much as other people. And I'd actually rather that they give the money to other content producers who would need it more than me. That's one of the reasons I don't monetize my channel. And But the other thing is, as I said, it does start to take over the channel. And I used to watch a whole lot of homesteading channels, but they're always shilling things. And the other thing that they would do that sort of annoyed me was they're really big on the aesthetics for the channel. So they'd have all these what are those things called? Those drones, and they'd have these sort of sweeping shots of the drone kind of flying over some castle or something, or over a barn, or what have you. And it seemed to be, and they would do this whole sort of thing of like them doing their morning routine, sort of holding one of those GoPro type things in one hand and a bucket of feed in the other, and going off to feed their chickens or what have you. And it very much became about the kind of aesthetics rather than the actual thing that they were going to talk about in that video. So I've sort of steered away from all of that for that reason also. I wanted to become about the aesthetics. Even though I think aesthetics are important.
They certainly are. That's been a discussion that I plan to have in the future. It's sort of just about aesthetics and art, because so much of what gets talked about. I have a friend from Brazil who is responsible for just about 99% of all the artwork done for the channel, which is interesting because if you ever to see a picture of him, like, he's what you would call the stereotypical art hoe. He's got the septum piercing, the long hair, the side shaved head, but somehow he ends up in just the circles of a bunch of right wingers. And he's but he talks about that a lot. It's just that he has what he calls the anti-podcast action sort of thing going about, where so many people would like to sort of talk or discuss theory or discuss just things that they read, and not maybe creating things or whatnot. Which is why I kind of enjoy when people actually do go out of their way to write books or whatnot. Like, that's something that I've been working on, because you had mentioned people expect something out of you once you kind of get used to doing it. I kind of have the same problem here with the channel. It's not a problem, I don't get me wrong. I enjoy talking about international relations and geopolitics. It's something that I studied. It's something I enjoy keeping up with. But at the same time, I do want to take more steps to do more. So I plan on, my goal for by the end of the year is to have my essay collection published. So that's something that I've been working on, along with sort of more culture stuff rather than just the strict international relations bit. But yeah, I mean, I think though at the end of the day, it never hurts to have the passive thing. I just don't think that you can let it consume all aspects of you. This is why I always tell younger people to tell to be mindful about how long you're on the internet or how much the screen time is, because the last 2.5 years, to say the least, have done irreparable damage, especially to younger people. And it does always bother me in that regard, because I guess I'm getting to the point now in my age where people are asking me for opinions or for advice on things. Younger gentlemen in their early 20s or 19-year-olds, I'll get a DM or a comment about X, Y, and Z, and to me, it always throws me off, because it's something that I don't really know how to answer these questions, because it's just like I don't view myself as someone who's rather well established in a career or one to give any meaningful life advice. But it's just an interesting position where the generations are now being looked up to, and it's why I wanted to also have like someone who's older than myself to come on, just because I think generational perspectives are very important.
Yeah, definitely. It's funny. In some ways, I am very Gen X, but in other ways, I don't feel like it. I always feel like I'm sort of immature or something when I compare myself to other people of my generation, because they're really concerned about their careers and their mortgages and all of this sort of stuff. And I don't, or renovating their kitchens or whatever they're doing. And I'm just not interested in that kind of stuff. I mean, I do various things, but I don't identify myself or define myself by that. So it's weird. I don't actually fit in with a lot of other people from my generation. I either like hanging around with younger guys who sort of, they're still in that phase where they have all that energy and that sort of lost for life, or people who are considerably older than me who have been through all of that and they're retired now, and they have a very different perspective. There's something about older people here in the countryside. Maybe it's a self-selecting group, but I've been in a few organizations where some of them have been really knowledgeable about certain things in ways that younger generations just aren't. I always find it weird interacting with people from my generation, because I don't feel very much like them, and I can't really relate to them. It's kind of strange. I can relate to some younger people who are sort of struggling with the sort of decline, and are not going to have the same level of comfort as earlier generations. And I can relate to some of the really old people who have a very old-fashioned perspective on things. But people in my age, actually, I find it quite difficult to relate to them. It's kind of strange.
I wonder if that's a common thing with maybe individuals on, you call it the true right, or just the right, dissident, true, the authentic reactionary, as Panama Hat likes to say. But because I kind of grew up the same way. Besides the military brat thing, I didn't really get along with a lot of kids my age. I always appreciated talking to adults or older people to learn from their wisdom. And now, due to the internet, the millennial or the Zoomer struggle is something that I can definitely understand, especially now that they're coming of age and are getting involved or invested in politics, because it's just they're sort of picking up on, especially in America, they're picking up on a lot of the same things that their predecessors did, and they're trying to not repeat the same mistakes. And so they're looking towards older people, or they're trying to relate to their millennial or Gen X counterparts, where it's just they're trying not to do the same thing over and over again. And a lot of times they end up doing so, but it is sort of refreshing that they're sort of learning from those that came before them. It is something that I kind of stress, every day with the channel, is that I try to show things that one of the things that I love to do on the channel that doesn't get the most views, but I'm going to keep doing it anyway. The fishing videos will continue until the view count improves. And it's just like, you need to have a hobby. You need to do things that are not related to the internet. And so, like if I'm going to go fishing, I'm just going to give you a long unscripted rant on something that's been on my mind. I want to humanize myself, not just be like, oh, this is your weird parasocial relationship. It's like, no, like you really should have hobbies. You really should be doing things in these times, because if your entire life is online, it's going to be very hard when things get tough for you to have a network or to enjoy things like that. So it's just a part of the things that I look at in the world, and it's just like, yeah, we need to be doing well for ourselves, personally speaking.
Yeah, it just occurred to me that if you ever meet Morgoth, you two could just do fishing videos.
Well, he's the guy actually that inspired me to do it. So I'm actually planning on having Morgoth on. I sent him a message on Telegram, and I was like, would you mind just wanting to come on and talk about fishing and like the importance of being with nature? And I got sort of like the yeah, sure, okay kind of deal. Like, this is an odd topic to talk about, but I'll entertain it. So I need to actually schedule that with him, because I would love to, if I ever get the chance to go back to the UK, or really just travel abroad again, given the current situation with how travel is for a lot of places. I would definitely love to actually go fishing with him. It's just something that I appreciate. Because the reason why I actually wanted to do the stream is because I was on Academic Agent's Unpopular Opinions, and Carl Benjamin was on, Sargon, and someone had asked me a question: how am I enjoying the fishing? And Carl just sort of scoffed, and he's just like, I find fishing to be boring. And so just my entire impetus for making this entire stream is just to tell Carl why fishing is good for the soul and why you should do it.
Yeah. Well, he and I are old friends from way back. But yeah, Morgoth, the funniest thing here, I don't know if you saw this one, the funniest thing he ever did on his channel, because he has that sense of humor, and It's just incredible. And I can't remember what the actual video was about, but he told this story about when he was a kid going swimming with his sister and his parents. Yeah, and he's, because he's got that accent, and he has that really dry sense of humor. And he was talking about how they were pulling guys who'd fallen off oil rigs out of the North Sea with hypothermia, and his parents are saying to his sister and to him, don't be soft, get in the water, go for a swim. That I'm sure if you two just started talking about fishing, he'd have all sorts of funny stories to tell about fishing as a kid with his dad or something.
Yeah.
I think it'd be very entertaining, actually, just for you two to talk about fishing.
Well, it's kind of funny because not too long ago, someone from work had introduced me to someone to go out for like for dinner to date. I'm single at the current moment, and she was a foreign exchange student. She's from the north, and so we're having dinner and we're having coffee actually, and she starts talking, and the only thing that I can think about in my mind is like, this woman sounds like the female version of Morgoth, and I'm trying not to smirk, and I'm trying not to say, you really remind me of my favorite person that does hate reading The Guardian. It's just
yeah.
So I was like, I can't do this to continue on for another one, because I'm just thinking that I can't, I'm just going to think hello there folks every time that she talks, and I couldn't do it.
Yeah, really boils me peas. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, he's a character. I think getting him on any stream, you could get him talking about anything, and it would be both insightful and hilarious. He's a real gem.
Yeah, he certainly is. I'm kind of glad. It's strange to think about, because how the phrase goes, like long time listener, first time caller, and so it's just like a long time of like listening to just a bunch of people that I've listened to for years, whether it's like Morgoth or Semi-Agog or the Distributist, and it's just now it's that weird sort of like, oh, I'm actually streaming with these people and my input is being asked for. It's a very weird thing sometimes. So now it's just like that sort of transcends into the real life when someone's like, do you want to go out with this foreign exchange chick from the north?
Yeah, that must be a strange thing. It's a bit like Led Zeppelin meeting Elvis. That sort of thing of the up and comers meeting their idols. Must be a strange thing. There was something I was going to say about this, but I've completely forgotten now. I think it'd be good for you to do a stream with Morgoth. Be great.
I'm reading the chat, and someone says that they refuse to believe that I've been with anybody, and oh boy, I hate to break the news to him that there's a terrible Substack I wrote called Chaste that's gonna just tell you the exact opposite of that. Which is funny, just sort of I think a lot of people that kind of come from these spheres when they're as younger people, where it's just like very much the party around, get around lifestyle, and then there's something that sort of brings them to sort of the right in a lot of ways. Some people did it online, others it's like I changed geography, and so I started being less and less of sort of a conservatarian type person into like really appreciating the home and hearth, and then kidney failure happens, and then you like really have a come to Jesus meeting, and you start really appreciating tradition, religion, and all of that. And it's a long story short of how I ended up to where I am now, just very much a on the sort of true right of things, where it's just your encounters with mortality and the importance of the small town kind of really changes your frame.
Yeah, I imagine it would. Absolutely. Have you heard of Paul Kingsnorth?
I have not, no.
Oh, I think you'd really be interested in him. I just discovered him the other day. I think it was through the American Sun. I followed a link from there or something. Anyhow, that guy Paul Kingsnorth, I think you'd be really interested in him because he was really heavily involved. He's slightly older than me. I think he's around 50. He was really heavily involved in the environmental movement back in the day, but he sort of fell out of favor with that. Many of his ideas haven't changed, but he's very much into sort of local solutions and this sort of thing. He's written a number of books. So he's English. He moved to the west of Ireland on a fairly sort of remote property, and he's sort of doing this whole kind of thing there. But he converted to Orthodox Christianity at the beginning of 2021. So he's had a fairly interesting kind of intellectual journey, and his whole thing of sort of writing about modernity and the woes of everyone being sort of co-opted by the machine, by technology, and the social changes that have been unleashed as a result of that. I think it would be well worth checking him out, and you might even be able to get him on your channel. He does talk to various people. I don't know if he sort of talks to people on the right as such, but yeah, he might be someone to check out and possibly get on your channel in the future.
Yeah, I'll have to definitely check him out. Yeah, I sort of took a similar journey in that regard, I suppose. In some ways, I didn't find sort of my journey back to Christianity didn't come through the internet either. It was sort of just I lived in a place where churches were still open, and I've got trying to take care of this newfound medical position that I was in at the time, and I did visit virtually every sort of service and denomination under the sun. I mean, I went to a traditional Latin mass. I went to an Anglican service. I went to every sort of Bible Belt, cowboy church. Those are very real things here in Texas, and I sort of just found my way. And then a friend of mine messaged me. It's just like, "We'll try," or like, here's the other option, Orthodoxy. And upon real first visitation to the liturgy, I guess I felt called. And my priest, who's working with me through my catechism, he had given me this like real sign about, he had a friend when he was younger who was like one of the first like kidney transplant patients in the United States. And I was like, well, if there was ever a sign that I was in the right place, this is probably it. So yeah, part of my life there's my lore.
Yeah, well, might be interesting to talk to this guy Paul Kingsnorth. I don't know how he came to become he's in the Romanian church apparently. There are a lot of Romanian immigrants, I guess, in Ireland. So I don't know how he came to be part of that, what that process was. But he started off as in fact, he was a deputy editor of the Ecologist magazine. I've never read that. I assume it's a sort of environmentalist magazine. And he was very much involved in environmental activism and that sort of stuff back in the 90s and so on. And he's written recently a lot on this sort of interesting phenomenon where people can have any personal identity that they want, because that basically doesn't threaten the system. Simultaneously, they're being corralled more and more into very tight restraints by the system in terms of how they can live their life and what they can say and do on things that actually matter. And there's been this complete hollowing out of the middle ground in terms of sort of community and so on. But he places this squarely as a spiritual problem. So I think you would be very interested in him, and I think you could probably have a really interesting chat with him too, particularly because you both have the same faith. That could be an interesting point. He's done stuff with Jonathan Peugeot. Do you know that guy?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, he's great.
He's done a couple of appearances on that guy's channel. I've only watched one of them, but it was fantastic actually. So I think you'd be interested in him, and you might even be able to get him on your channel.
Yeah, I was told apparently he spoke to Alex Kashuta recently, so maybe there is a chance because she and I are mutuals on Twitter. So perhaps there's something there.
Yeah.
But no, I think that raises an interesting question about a lot of things, because for us, I think many on the true right or the dissident, what have you, I think that there are many that will easily just say no, no questions asked, hands down, it's a spiritual problem, which I fundamentally go that 99.99% of the time. There are some things that are, of course, caused by material, but it's my frustration, I think, when talking to people that are more left-leaning, is that they don't ever acknowledge that there is something spiritual that is going on. Like, there's a reason why people tell you to put on the armor of God for a reason, or say spiritual warfare is real, because it is. And there's so many that just don't take it seriously when I think that they should, because then the body has a way of telling you that something is wrong. Like, you'll feel bad because you feel bad because your body, by more importance, your soul is trying to tell you something. And I wish that there'd be more acknowledgement of that, because, not to sound like Jimmy Carter, but like, there is a great malaise. It's not a material one. It's also a spiritual one.
There's definitely something going on. Something's really not right. I'm not a Christian, so I don't come at it from this angle, but there's something, it's almost like I don't believe in God, but I believe in Satan, because there's something funny going on. It's hard to look at a lot of what the elites do. It's hard to look at a lot of the culture at large, and imagine that anyone from any other period in history would not look at this and say that some sort of ancient evil has been awoken and is making its way through the land. There's something going on. And I can see Christians definitely would. I can see where they would come from on that. But I think even for other people, it's becoming harder and harder for people not to acknowledge that there's something very wrong going on. All of this sort of stuff going on in the culture wars is quite disturbing, actually. Yeah, I don't know where all of that's going. It's not good.
Well, that's why I always find it interesting that the left will say that they're not religious, but they do adhere to a sort of state-sanctioned religious, this is where I find it interesting. Like, I had mentioned earlier, just like these different eschatons that these people sort of debate over which one theologically is correct. I always point to that, I think it was in 2020, this interview that Noam Chomsky had done, because they always drag out him like Weekend at Bernie's to sort of discuss whatever perennial left-leaning issue is of the day. And, he was talking about climate change, and these two black women that were, I think one of them worked with the Bernie Sanders campaign. And he was just like, well, aren't you worried about your grandchildren drowning? And they were just like, no, we're concerned about getting shot like by the cops tomorrow. And just these debating forms of what is the true eschaton of the left, or what is the original sin, and things like that. It's always something that you do see, especially with Western leftists, is just this weird, even if you're an atheist, right? If you come from a Christian background, you'll be a Christian atheist in the same way that a Buddhist atheist will be a Buddhist, or a Buddhist atheist. And it's just interesting that those things have been sort of latched on to the sort of secular state that we live in, but it's not in any way, shape, or form. It's just a very interesting time to live in, that they want to address things in a secular name, in name only, nominally speaking, but it's definitely in some kind of religious aspect. But they're manifesting, I think, their own kind of, their own demons in their own form and fashion.
Yeah, some of them are aware of that, and some of them are not even aware of it, but it's that they have done so unwittingly. But I mean, I just can't look at a lot of stuff that's going on and not think that it's some sort of satanic church, basically. Like,
yeah,
Drag Queen Story Hour. How is that not? There's something very, very off about that. Yeah, I just can't look at a lot of stuff and think, no, this is okay. It's clearly not okay. There's something very, very wrong going on. And even just the whole sort of epidemic of mental illness and all of this sort of stuff. I mean, back in the day, like we're talking way back in the day, mental illness was sort of equated with being possessed by demons or that sort of thing. That there was this whole sort of stigma attached to it and so on. But increasingly, I'm sort of the opinion that it's sort of like that line about at a sufficiently high enough level of technology, it's indistinguishable from magic. I'm sort of the mind now that I mean, at a certain point, a lot of mental illness is indistinguishable from demon possession. And something like 25% of young people now supposedly have mental illnesses. Which I think, how was that ever possible in the past? Societies would have fallen apart if that had been the case. What's going on here? Are they either making it up, or is this just, we're reaching a point now where modernity is so bad that it's actually in people's reactions to that are indistinguishable from being demon possessed or possessed by witches or what have you?
Well,
It's
there's
very
also
strange.
it is, and I think that there's incentive for it, right? Because what's the saying, right? They sell it, they give us their poison so they can sell us their cures. And I had written this essay called Pharmacological Salvation because, if you have a problem that you're proud of, or that there's this sort of glorification, there's all those videos where I think there was one on Twitter that was just it shook me to my core, where it was just this like early 20s woman who was on like, I take 10 medications a week, and she's got these giant boxes of pills to like keep, but she says to keep her sane, which had various amounts of SSRIs, anti-reflux medications, blood pressure medications, but it was primarily to keep her in check along with her birth control. And I was just like, this is, if this is your idea of being normal, which to me was just absolute hysterics, this is just trying to keep the demon at bay. It wasn't anything more than that, which always throws me off. But at the same time, right, because of how the left operates, they're always the anathema of what would be considered normal or healthy to you and I. Like, this is why I do think that we've seen sort of the explosion in America where, like, oh, there's this significant rise of LGBT youth, or it's the incentive to be validated or to be considered in the in group. And, like, that's why I do think that progressives don't have a strong foundation for, like a straight white guy, because I mean, you look at sort of BreadTube, sort of our wonderful punching bag. It's just, well, how many straight white male BreadTubers inevitably transition? Because that's your only way out, really, as a straight white man on the left.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I do think part of it is the profit motive and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, it's like that sort of that phrase that's thrown around by people on the center right: go woke, go broke, or get woke, go broke, or whatever it is. Yes, but it's not just about the money. There is a spiritual aspect to this, that these people, they want to possess people not just so that they can milk them for money. There's something else going on there that's very disturbing, and it is that thing that Paul Kingsnorth, he's not the first person I've seen mention this, but this idea that you can have any of these sort of weird little quirks or fetishes or whatever. You can define yourself however you want, but on issues that really matter, those things are very much off limits. So they've completely hollowed out the natural state of affairs for people to have normal relationships with people in communities and faith and meaning in their lives. And all that's left is this sort of these surrogate activities, I guess, surrogate meaning, in the form of, well, I can call myself a demisexual unicorn or something, and you'd better respect my identity. But at the same time, there are extremely strict controls on how I can actually live my life in meaningful ways, and even on the material. This is possibly where I think the left is going to fall apart, because they promised material progress, but we're rapidly getting to the point where there will not be material progress. In fact, we're going backwards. Young people are not going to have the same level of material comfort that they once did. And yeah, your generation can, you have access to supercomputers in your hands that weren't around when I was 26. When was that? 2002. Yeah, smartphones weren't around in 2002. And I certainly couldn't look up any piece of information on a smartphone or communicate with someone on the other side of the planet or what have you. But in 2002, people could own a house and they could have a family. An ordinary person could still own a house and have a family. And they could still have meaning in their life through community and family and church, if they so chose. And even their jobs were more meaningful. So everyone's been corralled into this thing where you have very strict limits and material progress is actually declining. But, you can call yourself a demisexual unicorn if you like, and everyone must respect that. And you can put at the bottom of every email, you can put, my pronouns or whatever, whatever, nay and nay, whatever sound a unicorn makes. And everyone must respect this. And when they respond to you in an email, they must, dear nay or whatever, or nay did this, or whatever your pronouns are. But certainly on a spiritual level, but even increasingly on a material level, all of that's been hollowed out, and it's just a method of control. So even from a sort of I'm surprised that there isn't more of this on the hard left. Maybe there is a sort of Marxist analysis of how the captains of finance have basically completely they've done a huge con job on average people, even just from a materialistic point of view, let alone a spiritual point of view. But we never see that kind of thing.
Well, the actual people that do adhere to the Marxist school that I've been on a podcast twice with gentlemen that do have Marxist leanings, and they will flat out call that what it is, what exactly you described. But the issue is that the Marxists that actually do believe that, they really aren't the ones that kind of get mentioned, or the ones that sort of have the narrative control here, which is why it's always interesting, the obsession with BreadTube, I think, by some in our spheres, where it's just the reason why they're so interesting is because it's always interesting to see what logical contortions they put themselves in to just be, doubling down on liberalism, essentially, with the regime. It's never actually identifying the con jobs that they've, been hooked under. Which I guess is a sign that you're truly addicted or truly possessed by them in that regard. Or, of course, you've just been paid off by the said people that have conned you, which, again, there's a reason why actual socialist or Marxist types like Caleb Maupin are so hated, because, he writes a book called BreadTube Serves Imperialism, which is a great read. I don't know if it's a great title and it's a good book. I mean, when I bought it, I didn't know who Caleb Maupin was. I was just like, oh, this is an interesting title. And I bought it and I was like, oh, he's a die in the wool socialist. But he was just like, yeah, I do think that these people have handlers and whatnot. And then of course there was the philosophy tube individual who had been working in conjunction, I think, with the UK government over, the pandemic. So it does really, I think, illustrate that there's stuff that's going in that regard. But I just find that that's the importance for what we do. I think about, authenticity, doing things that are, on the ground, just even if it's taking care of your family or working with a network to homeschool children. I mean, the whole thing that we did in February, its theme was about navigating the ruins. And that's basically what we're going to have to do, is to really do band together for that navigation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, as we are nearing the 90-minute mark, there were, I think, 2 super chats that had came in, and then I'd like to get some shilling for you in, because I had noticed there was someone in the chat already talking about your book. So I'm going to get to these real quickly, and then we'll get to that. So let's see if the channel monetization will load. Here we go. So the first one was from Bolero for 393 for $5 US. Thank you so much. He says, Franklin, the member for Karen in the teal pantsuit would like to talk to you about your ballot drawing. Democracy must be respected. It's required.
Yeah. he's a known troublemaker, that guy. Yeah, he posts similar kind of comments on my channel. Yeah, he's funny. Well, yeah, that's right. There is this sort of. I was shocked and appalled actually when I went to vote. In fact, the member for our local area, he was there, but everyone was lined up, and there was this just this feeling, and the way people were interacting and that sort of thing, that this was a sacred ritual, and it was a meaningful ritual, rah rah rah, and I mean, I'm just so out of step with people in that regard. And afterwards, with the electoral coverage and so on and so forth, yeah, it was a sacred ritual, sort of the closest we come to sacred rituals in this country. Yeah, it's very much like that. And that's all sort of a reference to the video that I made about it. I called it something about the member for Karen would like to talk to, something like that.
Yeah. That's why I remember the video because I had saw the picture of the drawing. I think it was the thumbnail, which I was just like that. That's appreciated. It's the same way here in America, where it's no longer, I think, for a lot of like mainstream Republicans. I remember there was a poll in like 2017 where like 2/3 of mainstream Republicans would be okay for a more authoritarian type figure. But democracy is treated very much like a sacred religion here. Like it's a sacred act to participate and to vote. And people who worked elections or as election judges, like I did for 4 years, I was always told that you're like a sacred part of the system. Without you, you truly are the front lines of democracy. It just made it sound almost very World War II-esque, and it's just like, yeah, I don't believe you anymore. But boy, did 18-year-old me really buy into it.
This country is still not as far gone as America, and it's also massively more blue-pilled than America on a whole lot of issues. So the idea that this is all a complete joke and so on is very much a fringe idea over here still. The percentage of, because we are all forced to vote, you can actually get a decent idea on how many people just reject the entire system, because they actually publish the percentage of informal votes. And it's, depending on the electorate, it's somewhere between, it's no more than 6% usually. It's usually 3 to 6%. And that includes the people who have just made a mistake. They've incorrectly filled out the ballot, even though they were attempting to vote correctly, because you have to fill in everything and all of this. So they've just made a mistake. They didn't deliberately do it. So I don't know what percentage of those people there would be, but of the 6%, say half of them just made a mistake. So we're talking basically 3% of the population are really cynical. We're considerably farther behind you in terms of levels of cynicism and expecting the whole system to go down. I don't think many people really think it's going to go down. I don't think people think that 10 years from now much is going to be different.
Well, I think that's a good thing for the audience to know as well, just the sort of different perspectives overall. I mean, so much attention, of course, is put on America, but it's kind of good to know how the rest of the Anglosphere is doing. Lady of Shallot sends 449 pounds. Thank you so much. She's everywhere, really. I've seen her in almost every person's stream or channel, especially with Semiagog and others. She writes, good to see the Franklin here. I'm writing a letter to my teal member for Karen to request that the local clock tower be converted into a wind turbine.
So she lives in a part of Melbourne where there's a sort of a famous landmark. There's a clock tower at a major intersection, and I suggested to her that she should write to her member for Karen and insist that they pull down that clock tower and replace it with a wind turbine, so that that electorate could do its part against climate change. So we'll see how that's received. So yeah, I think that's the kind of stuff that we should do. We should troll. The only meaningful participation we can have in politics is to troll them now. Basically, just call them on that kind of stuff, or say, write a letter to Zali Steggall and ask her what her climate footprint was with all those ski trips when she was younger.
Yeah. Have you atoned for your carbon footprint yet?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
It's funny because part of the thing that I do with work is that I do these very long cross-county drives to go pick up things for documentation, fare box money, and whatnot. And I see a lot of wind turbines just across the pasture and ranch land where I live, and it's always just it's almost depressing because it's just like, that this like really nice scenic part of like American farmland has sort of been violated by modernity in a lot of ways. And there's this great image posted by this Twitter account called Mytho America, and he just sort of does these pictures of like posts of like parts of the United States that normally don't get attention. And he did this great picture of like wind turbines in the background and a dead bald eagle, and it was just like, oh, no, there's your price. If only
the symbolism of that.
If only some orange man warned us about the birds and wind turbines.
Yeah, well, all of that's going to be really interesting for those of us who subscribe to a sort of catabolic collapse type theory of the future. That there'll be some sort of entire industry in 100 years or 200 years of people salvaging all of these bits, resources from all of these broken down artifacts of the early 21st century, salvaging them. It's sort of like how after the collapse of Rome, people and in other places, people scavenged the stone and lead and what have you from all of these, the infrastructure of glory, and just to sort of build a wall in their field to keep their sheep in, or what have you, or as part of their house, or what have you. So what was once part of a pyramid or a coliseum or something ends up in a hovel somewhere in the countryside. And I think there'll be a whole kind of industry around that in 100, 200, 300 years, whatever, of people ripping off rusty panels from crumbling wind turbines, and then doing something with that metal, melting it down, reforging it, what have you. I don't think these things are going to age very well, actually.
They can't be recycled either, so they actually have to go out of their way to bury used wind turbine blades. So I could imagine just roving bands of just people trying to excavate them to maybe build fencing or some kind of rampart.
Yeah, that sort of thing. I wonder what's going to happen to all of the solar panels, actually. It's been a big thing over the past decade or so to get solar panels here in Australia, and I wonder when people sign up to install solar panels, if because they have a lifespan, I wonder if the price includes removing them once they've outlived their lifespan, because I presume you can't just recycle them easily because they have all sorts of things in them. I wonder if that's included. So I can't help wondering if there are going to be a whole lot of people in the next 10, 15 years who are going to have to get rid of these things, and I wonder where they're all going to end up and what's going to happen to them. And even if people might not be able to afford to get them removed, so there might be all these houses with sort of crumbling solar panels on the roofs in 50 years. They'll still be there. They haven't worked in 35 years or something, but they're still there. They'll still be there. yeah, well, it's going to be sort of strange, and maybe, as you said, someone will find some other use for them as a fence or rampart or something, and so there'll be this weird kind of Mad Max landscape of silicon solar panels in fields, keeping the sheep in, or something like that.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. There's this like really niche sort of environmentalist slash like social problem that has been raised about electronic waste or e-waste because a lot of it gets shipped to Africa and they're
Yeah,
trying to extract it for like gold or rare earth minerals and it often, they're exposed to carcinogens and things like that. I just imagine that you would sort of see the return of like, black lung when they're trying to
yeah,
extract whatever material they can be. What a very dim sort of like your Victorian future dystopia. I mean, this could be a very excellent science fiction setting, steampunk, but with the cancer.
yeah, yeah. I saw a documentary years ago about these kids in some African village, and they were trying to get the copper out of wiring, and they just had all these fridges and washing machines and what have you, just sort of half-lifing into the soil out the back of the village, and that was bad enough. But then they'd ripped all the guts out of these things and thrown them in a big pile, and created a bonfire. Basically, because the quickest way to get the metals was to melt the plastic off, burn the plastic off, and then there'd be this mess, and they'd wait till that would cool down enough to harden, and then they'd take it off somewhere else. But all this stuff was going into the water table, it's all going into the air, and these villages look like absolute hellscapes. Yeah, I imagine there'll be a return of some of that here. Pretty scary.
Indeed. So that's certainly something to think about there, Naughty, the gentleman in chat. There you go. There's your ecological mess of the future that we're not talking about in sort of mainstream discourse. But well, I really wanted to thank you for coming on. I thought that this was a good discussion and just a good chance to have you on stream and have more people get a chance to check out who you are and what you do. So if there's anything that you would like to share, shill, or plug, by all means.
Do you want to do the book shilling?
Oh, of course. I've been told by
No,
many people that you need to shill your book.
it's more for their sake than mine. I'm not really into personal shilling, but yeah, okay. So I haven't published anything. I'm in the process of editing the second book, so it's a fictional trilogy. I'm in the process of editing the second one. I'm about a quarter of the way through editing it now. I'm planning to get both the first and the second one, self-publishing format by the end of the year. We'll see if that happens. But the first one, I actually, rather than publish it in print form, I recorded the entire thing. It was 500,000 words, which for perspective is longer than War and Peace. So I recorded it, 71 chapters, and I released 2 chapters per week from partway through 2019 until the final one came out on New Year's Eve 2019. So you can actually go over to my channel and watch all of those. It's just an audio recording for each one called Wards of NC. So yeah, you can go and listen to them, and the plan is to get these things out by the end of the year. There's a third, so it's a trilogy. So the third one I haven't begun writing. I know the basic plot and how it's going to end and so on. But yeah, it's basically, I would describe it as sort of like Tolkien meets Tolstoy. It's kind of it says in a high fantasy setting, but it deals with geopolitics and a lot. I wrote these 2 back in was it 2013? I think it was 2013, and there was a whole sort of backstory with that too. It was this sort of manic enterprise. But I wrote them back then. I had just sort of discovered neo-reaction and had all these ideas in my head, and I was just sort of writing as fast as I was reading, basically. And it's interesting to sort of look back on all of that. There were comments that I made in the book, the first book, about various sort of social issues, and they've actually come to pass since then. It's amazing how much the world has changed since then. But yeah, so basically it deals with all these sort of big issues, and then there were sort of personal issues. Like it's kind of a coming of age story, and it's all about these sort of personal relationships between the characters. Sort of they go on a journey, so there's this sort of longing for their home, their homesickness, and longing for each other because they get separated at various points, and this sort of coming of age. Yeah, so it sort of covers a lot of things, as 500,000 words will tend to do. So you can go and check that out. I haven't really gone into it too much in that explanation. It's pretty vague.
Well,
but,
all the more reason for them to go listen and check it out.
Yeah, it takes a while, like obviously it sort of builds. The first few chapters might not necessarily give them an indication of where it all goes, but yeah, sort of influence. Not long before I had read War and Peace, and sort of vaguely I haven't really read fantasy other than Tolkien, and it was sort of influenced by other things like sort of I quite like that sort of early 20th century Germanic mindset or something, like Hermann Hesse and Carl Jung and so on. They're sort of longing for spirituality and that kind of thing. Sort of influenced by that kind of stuff. And I can't remember whether I had read The Diamond Age by then by Neil Stevenson, but that kind of thing as well. Have you read that book?
I have not. No, I have read War and Peace more than once.
Right. Yeah. So it's sort of influenced by all that kind of stuff. On the one hand, a kind of top-down view of geopolitics and culture and economics and so on, and then this sort of personal spiritual journey of growth, that kind of thing. Yeah, anyhow, the second one I'm working on at the moment, editing it, and hopefully I'll have print editions of the two of them out by the end of the year. In the meantime, people can listen to them.
Fantastic. That's great.
Yeah.
And you have your monthly stream coming up. When is that?
That's in about 45 minutes.
Well, fantastic. So by all means,
Yeah.
as soon as we're done here, we'll give the Franklin a break, and he'll be doing his monthly stream. So if you haven't heard of him, if this is your first time being exposed to him, go check him out on his channel. It's linked down below in the description. So for everyone who's still listening and tuning in, I will see you all on Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern US time. I will have Mr. Christopher Sandbach to join me in the discussion of the history and geopolitical implications of the Monroe Doctrine. So a little bit of history, but more international relations coming. So chat, all of you now head over to the Franklin's channel. And thank you again so much for coming on. I've heard great praises of you from many people, so I'm glad that we had a chance to chat.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, thank you. And we'll everyone go head on over to his channel now and get ready and get cozy in the chat. Until then, I'll see you all next time.